Seriously, I want to thank everyone who's been so gracious in welcoming me to campus. I want to thank the Murphy Hendricks Foundation as well for this extraordinary opportunity. It's been a real pleasure to come and recharge my batteries and reconnect with old friends and make new friends, and I look forward to corresponding with you in the future. So do not fear. Even though the handout starts with Cicero and Aristotle, you are in the right place. I came to realize a couple of months ago that what I do really is I'm a person who looks for a needle in a haystack. So if you'll stay with me this evening, we're going to go through this haystack. And if you like hay, it's a great place. And then if you feel a little prick, that'll be the needle, the one little thing that I find after going through lots and lots of material. But what I've come to sort of accept about my scholarship is I might find one little thing, but it's always the joy in the looking. So I love to look through the haystack and find just that one thing. So if you think about fear in the Agricola, as I'm going through what will seem like piece of hay by piece of hay by piece of hay, when we find that needle, it's going to feel really good. So that's where we're headed. So let's just start. A fair amount of dread suffuses the life of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, the biography of the governor of Britain, written by his son-in-law, the Roman historian Tacitus. From the outset, the reader worries about the welfare of a man whose biographer must begin by asking permission for his subject matter, Tacitus says. To record the life of one who has passed away, I need pardon, which I should not have to ask. From the burning of books and the expulsion of philosophers in paragraph 2 to the death of Agricola shrouded in rumor in paragraph 43, fear really permeates this narrative. The Latin lexicon of fear in the Agricola includes, and my list goes from the most to the least often used, the Latin nouns formido, terror, metus, timor, and trepidatio. Adjectives formidulosus, anxious, pavidus, trepidus, and intrepidus, where that prefix is intensifying. And the verbs terreo, timeo, vereor, pauesco, and exterreo. You will have heard in this Latin list the words that generate so much of the English vocabulary of fear: formidable, terror, anxiety, trepidation. So I proceed on the assumption that the Latin words cover much of the same semantic ground as the English vocabulary of fear. In both languages, meanings run from terror, fright, and panic, with their attendant physical responses at one extreme, to intermediate mental responses of dread and anxiety, to simple statements of regret or even apologies, such as, I fear it will rain, or I'm afraid I'll have to miss your party. In part, the semantic range is dependent on the specificity of the object of fear. The terror, fright, and panic of the battlefield is tangible and immediate, whereas the dread or anxiety over an emperor's displeasure is intangible and remote, while fear of a social faux pas is merely semantic hyperbole. The life of Julius Agricola encompasses the scope, as we'll see. In her study, she counts 43 occurrences of the Latin words for fear in the Agricola, and don't panic, I am not going to march you through all 43 examples. But Remondetti observes that such vocabulary is to be expected, since the bulk of the work is concerned with the military conquest of Britain. However, she finds it surprising that there are relatively few terms for fear in the final chapters that describe the last years of Agricola's life spent in Rome under the shadow of the tyrannical emperor Domitian. So clearly the sense of foreboding derives from something more than just diction. Mastione Giovanni delves into fear and anxiety in Tacitus's Annals, the magisterial work chronicling the Julio-Claudian dynasty from Tiberius to Nero. To divine fear, Mastione Giovanni turns to Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and that's why it's the first thing on your handout. a philosophical treatise in which Cicero parses fear into its physical components. So let's take a look. I'll just read the English for you. But those feelings which are included under fear, they define thus. There is sloth, which is dread of ensuing labor, shame and terror, which affect the body, hence blushing attends shame, and paleness and tremor and chattering of the teeth attend terror, cowardice, which is an apprehension of some approaching evil, dread, a fear that unhinges the mind, whence comes the line of that poet Ennius, then dread discharged all wisdom from my mind. Fainting is the associate and constant attendant on dread, confusion, a fear that drives away all thought, alarm, a continued fear. Based on the descriptions in this passage, Mastione Giovanni explores the physical manifestations and expressions of fear and anxiety, and the way they betray ideology and politics, specifically in relation to the struggle for power. The reign of the Emperor Nero in particular, the dramatic stories of his mother Agrippina the Younger and his wife Poppaea. This whole reign is fraught with fear and emotion that's intrinsic to tyranny. From her reading of the annals, Mastione Giovanni is able to draw conclusions about Tacitus's critique of the transfer of power in his own day. In the Agricola, the fear is less dramatic, less physically defined and displayed. Yet, like Mastione Giovanni, we could infer from the Agricola a commentary on the political context in which it was written. Though Cicero is useful, David Levine maintains that Aristotle provides a better model, more closely aligned with the practice of the Roman historians. He distinguishes between what he calls audience-based, this is he, Levine, not Aristotle. Levine distinguishes between what he calls audience-based and analytic modes of presentation, and analyzes the representations of pity and fear in Tacitus's Histories, a work which documents the civil wars of the year 69, when Rome saw 4 emperors in the course of 12 months, events that offer plenty of scope for fear. While Levine is careful not to impute a direct philosophical influence of Aristotle upon the Roman historians, he extrapolates from Tacitus the conclusion that, quote, historians linked emotion to reason more closely than by simply deriving the former from the latter, end quote. That is to say, when describing causes and effects, the historians did not only attribute a cause for an event to an emotion. For example, the anger of soldiers can cause the downfall of a general. Historians were also keen to describe how events caused emotions. The death of a general can generate emotions of fear, anger, or pity. Insofar as emotions encode political attitudes, they do not interfere with the rational part of the historian's work. Rather, they contribute to the enterprise of historical explanation. Now, my thinking about fear in the biography of Julius Agricola is also influeed by 2 further studies of fear beyond Tacitean contexts. In her recently completed dissertation on fear-mongering in late Republican Rome, Fields pays close attention to political context. Because her sources are primarily political speeches, Aristotle's rhetoric is a useful starting point, and this is passage 2. Aristotle says, let fear be a kind of pain or disturbance deriving from an impression of a future evil that is destructive or painful. For not all evils are to be feared. For example, whether one will be unjust or slow, but as many as are productive of great pain or destruction, and these are not distant, but rather seem near so as to impend, for things that are remote are not greatly feared. Fear necessitates deliberation, in due proportion, of course. When an individual is confronted by a life-threatening danger, the decision to run is split second. When a group is confronted by an imposing danger, on the other hand, they must be made to think carefully about the appropriate response. Therefore, a speaker must arouse a degree of fear in the deliberative body. So in the geometry of fear-mongering, the speaker must calculate the degree of his pitch. Too much fear will strike such panic that the audience will freeze or even flee from the matter. Too little fear and the audience will disregard the danger. Field's analyses of Cicero's Pro Marina, Philippics 3 and 4, and the speech of Lepidus in Sallust's Histories demonstrate that even the most skillful speakers take a great risk when engaging in fear-mongering. Such brinkmanship is at work in Tacitus's balanced portrayal of fear in the Agricola. The moderation that defines the character of Agricola is more than a personality trait. For Tacitus, it is a mode of expression. David Constant also begins with Aristotle, although he is less interested in the rhetorical uses of fear and more interested in the ways fear mediates social status. Constant argues that, quote, the impression that causes fear derives from a judgment about the world, namely that someone with a motive to harm is in a position to do so, end quote. This person with a motive to harm subjugates others to himself by virtue of the fear he instills. When the motive is positive, social status is maintained or even elevated. So take, for instance, a judge maintains his authority by virtue of the fear of the punishment that he can inflict. Such fear deters potential criminals and maintains social order. A tyrant who reigns by terror, on the other hand, diminishes his sovereignty, since subjects who respond with courage or good judgment are held in higher esteem than the tyrant. Fear becomes not so much an exhibition of cowardice as a reasonable response to a plausible threat. One of the many reasons our Agricola outstrips the Emperor Domitian is because he levels reasonable responses to plausible threats. Attention to fear in the biography reveals that although Domitian outranks Agricola in birth and wealth, Agricola outranks Domitian in honor and esteem. So from my own examination of the vocabulary of fear in the Agricola, I found two rather surprising literary allusions. One to the Roman historian Sallust, and the other to the Greek historian Thucydides. To follow the discussions of Sallust and Thucydides, you need only notice the verbal echoes that will be evident on the handout. So this is why I configured it so that the charts would stay very close together. So you'll see the Tacitus in column A and then the Sallust or the Thucydides following. When we pay attention to Tacitus's engagement with Sallust, his predecessor, and Thucydides, we start to see problems of ethnic hybridity and status incongruity, two of the biggest fears that confront any imperial expansionist enterprise. As conquerors of Western Europe, the Romans had much to fear indeed. So let's turn then to Agricola and Jugurtha. This is part one. I shall proceed by discussing relevant references to fear, for the most part in the order in which they appear in the biography. So I'm basically going to walk you through the biography of Agricola. So we're going to begin with Formido and Anxius in Tacitus's description of Agricola's military apprenticeship under Suetonius Paulinus. So this is passage 3a. Without the recklessness with which young men often make the profession of arms a mere pastime, and without indolence, he never availed himself of his tribune's rank or his inexperience to procure enjoyment or escape from duty. He sought to make himself acquainted with the province, known to the army. He would learn from the skillful and keep pace with the bravest, would attempt nothing for display, would avoid nothing from fear, and would be at once careful and vigilant. So the Latin is nihil ob formidinem recusare, and et anxius et intensus, once careful and vigilant. So note the assumption that tribunes are overweening, recruits are deliberate underachievers. Agricola performs between these two extremes. Litotes heightens the effect of his bravery. He refused no task because of fear. He's a model officer. Agricola is properly anxious. Here it's translated as careful. You'll see in handout number 4, when applied to Domitian, the same adjective takes on a pejorative tone. Domitian receives news of Agricola's success with a happy face but an anxious heart. Now, besides prefiguring the anxieties of Domitian that surface at full force at the end of the biography, Agricola, the passage in passage 3a, it also recalls a passage from Sallust's brief history of the war with Jugurtha, the African rebel. Of course, traces of Sallust's war with Jugurtha are everywhere in Tacitus's Agricola, from the formal composition of the ethnographic digressions to details of battle narrative. Sallust is a constant presence in the words of Dylan Saylor. When Tacitus says that Agricola, let's see if it's 4.3 on your handout, okay, in the column 3a, retinuitque quod est difficilimum. So when Tacitus says that Agricola retained from his learning that which is most difficult, moderation, the phrase quod est difficilimum echoes the Sallust that will be quoted below. As a young man, Jugurtha was sent to Spain to apprentice with the Roman general Scipio because his ill-intentioned uncle Micipsa was troubled by his ambition and popularity. Micipsa hoped Jugurtha would meet his end, either by vaunting his courage or at the hands of his enemy. Well, nothing of the sort, in fact, occurred. This is passage 3b. Jugurtha came to understand the nature of Scipio and the behavior of the enemy by working very hard and taking great pains, as well as by the most deferential obedience and frequent encounters with danger. He, Jugurtha, had soon reached such a degree of distinction that he was overwhelmingly dear to our men and the greatest source of terror to the Numantines. He was committed in battle and good at strategy, a very difficult combination, for the latter is generally accustomed to engender fear through foresight, the former rashness through daring. As Jugurtha worked to understand the nature of the enemy, morem hostium cognovit, so Agricola sought to make himself acquainted with the province and known to the army, noscere provinciam, nosci exercitui. Sallust's ablative phrase, multo labore, multaque cura, by working very hard and taking great pains, is recast by Tacitus with adverbs, again in litotes, nec licenter, neque segniter, without the recklessness and without indolence. As Jugurtha embraced danger, so Agricola did not avoid it. So thus, as Jugurtha impressed Scipio, so Agricola impressed Suetonius. As Micipsa was threatened by his nephew Jugurtha, terebat, so Domitian was worried about Agricola's success and popularity. Talibus curis exercitus in number 4 on the handout. To the extent that the attempts of Micipsa and Domitian lessen the threats to their power backfire, so Jugurtha and Agricola are perceived as managing their fears appropriately. As the estimation of the ruling Micipsa and Domitian diminishes, so our estimation of Jugurtha and Agricola increases. In his first year as governor of Britain, Agricola knew the importance of fear in keeping the tribes in check, Tacitus says, well aware that he must follow up the prestige of his arms, and that in proportion to his first success would be the terror of the other tribes, he formed the design of subjugating the Isle of Man. To keep his soldiers disciplined in his second year, he was energetic on the field, leading by example, and this is passage 5 in column A. When summer came, assembling his forces, he continually showed himself in the ranks, praising good discipline, and kept the stragglers in order. He would himself choose the position of the camp, himself explore the estuaries and forests. Meanwhile, he would allow the enemy no rest. laying waste their territory with sudden incursions and having sufficiently alarmed them, he would then by forbearance display the allurements of peace. So compare Jugurtha's preparations for war in column B. Jugurtha made every preparation with great care, lost no time, gathered an army, tried to win over, either by alarming them or by the prospect of rewards, the communities which had defected from him, fortified his positions, refurbished or bought weapons, enticed the Roman slaves, and used money to influence men in the garrisons. In short, he left nothing untouched or restful, but was active on all fronts. Both passages are built on a string of historical infinitives with the phrase nihil pati in penultimate position. In the Tacitus, nihil interim apud hostes quietum pati, and in the Sallust, nihil in actum neque quietum pati. The unmistakable verbal echo reinforces the impression that, like Jugurtha, Agricola too is an energetic and capable leader. There's also a degree to which the correspondences between passages 5a and b prefigure the content of the very next paragraph, in which Tacitus describes the Romanization of Britain. The Britons were won over by the apparent benefits of Roman architecture, Roman education, Roman rhetoric, to such an extent that they even adopted the toga. They were unaware that these allurements and trappings of what they called civilization were really a part of their enslavement. That's Agricola, paragraph 21. So whereas Jugurtha outright bullied or bribed the people of Vaga, Agricola seduced the Britons and finessed their cooperation. Now in his third year, Agricola had established his authority, and Tacitus reevaluates his character from the vantage point of his subordinates, who regarded him as an impartial witness. Although some said he was too harsh, he was as severe to the bad as he was lenient toward the good. This is passage 6. But none of his resentment remained hidden away in his mind, so that you need not fear his silence. The verb is timeres. The comparison to Domitian is implicit, and the imagery of a tyrant who stores up his resentments resurfaces in the portraits of Tiberius and Nero in the Annals. Curious, though, is that second-person potential subjunctive, which draws the reader into the narrative, or you might say propels the ethos of the character beyond the narrative at hand. Now, the only two uses of the verb vereor in the biography occur in paragraphs 35.4 and 37.1, listed in passage 7. In both instances, the nominative perfect participle veritus allows Tacitus to focalize the inner thoughts of Agricola as he responds to the shifting dynamics of battle. The first passage says, Agricola, fearing that from the enemy's superiority of force he would be attacked in front and on the flanks, widened his ranks. And when the Britons in reserve on the hilltops began to hem in the victorious Romans, this is the second passage, Agricola, fearing this very movement, opposed their advance with 4 squadrons. Now, to my ear, these uses of veritus are among the weakest expressions of fear in the biography, as if to say, I was afraid that would happen. The weakened semantics puts Agricola in charge of his own fears. In both instances, he makes immediate decisions based on reasonable apprehensions. So the overall impression is that fear is a positive value in the character of Agricola. It leads him to make good choices. It tempers any tendency he may have to excess in handling his troops, and he deploys it prudently against the Britons. The verbal correspondences with Sallust may prove merely that Jugurtha had assimilated Roman culture so successfully as to be a suitable comparandum for Agricola. To subjugate and govern non-Romans, one needs to adopt the strategies of the cleverest of the non-Romans, making Jugurtha a suitable role model. Yet once we admit these illusions, it's difficult to suppress the conclusion. As Jugurtha was eventually captured, brought to Rome, and after gracing Marius's triumph, died in the Tullianum, so Agricola will be recalled, decreed a triumph, only to die under a cloud of worry and unsubstantiated rumor of poison. No matter how Roman he may become, Jugurtha, like Hannibal before him, can only fail, not only because of a flawed character, but because the conflation of ethnic categories cannot be sustained. Latent in the parallels I've outlined between Jugurtha and Agricola is a challenge to our easy notions of Roman and non-Roman. So in part 2, we're going to look at fear from the other side of the table. I need to turn the hand up. So part 2 I call metus hostilis, which is Latin for fear of the enemy. And it's a phrase that appears in Sallust, and it refers to the fear of the enemy that unites the Romans. So about 1/4 of the biography is taken up with the narrative of the Battle of Mons Graupius, in which all of Agricola's skills and abilities culminate. Before the battle, the generals exhort their troops. Agricola and the enemy leader Calgacus deliver rousing speeches in which fear is persuasive, although neither speaker engages in outright fear-mongering. Rather, they are sensitive to the need to arouse just enough but not too much fear. So Agricola refers to fear only in a hunting metaphor. It's interesting. He compares the enemy to timid animals. Agricola says, just as when the huntsman penetrates the forest and the thicket, all the most courageous animals rush out upon him, while the timid and feeble are scared away by the very sound of his approach, so the Britons have long since fallen, and all the rest are a crowd of frightened men. They are paralyzed in their tracks by fear. References to fear in the speech of the enemy leader Calgacus are much more complex. So this is passage 8a, the first part of the passage. To our strifes and discords the Romans owe their fame, and they turn the errors of an enemy to the renown of their own army, an army which, composed as it is, of every variety of nations, is held together by success and will be broken up by disaster. These Gauls and Germans, and I blush to say these numerous Britons, who though they lend their lives to support a stranger's rule, have been its enemies longer than its subjects, you cannot imagine to be bound by fidelity and affection. Fear and terror, to be sure, are feeble bonds of attachment. Remove them, and those who have ceased to fear will actually begin to hate. Calgacus effectively dissolves the proviso in the tyrant's manifesto, let them hate so long as they fear. Tacitus had a knack for criticizing his own fellow citizens in oblique ways. So when Calgacus tells his troops that fear and terror are feeble bonds of attachment, we might also hear an indictment of a Roman Senate for submitting to the fear and terror of the emperor. The foreign Calgacus thus becomes a distant voice of freedom. As a non-Roman, he can register criticism without causing any real distress to the Roman ear. Likewise, Tacitus can hide, in the words of the barbarian king, his own dissatisfaction with the status quo. Calgacus goes on to belittle the few Romans who will be present in the battle for trembling in their ignorance of the landscape. And he encourages his troops. He says, do not fear their empty display. He reminds his troops that the Gauls and Germans who fight for the Romans have nothing to fear. Calgacus exhorts his troops in terms that recall the ideology expressed by Pericles in the funeral oration as recorded by the Greek historian Thucydides, and this is passage 8b. At Athens, we live exactly as we please, and yet are just as ready to encounter every legitimate danger. In proof of this, it may be noticed that the Lacedaemonians do not invade our country alone, but bring with them all their confederates, while we Athenians advanced unsupported into the territory of a neighbor, and fighting upon foreign soil, usually vanquish with ease men who are defending their homes. Now, the message in both speeches is that hybrid armies are weak. Based on Pericles' ideology, hybridity ought to be the downfall of the barbarian army. Yet in the speech of Calgacus, Tacitus imputes hybridity not to the barbarian army, but to the Roman army. What works to the advantage of the Athenians becomes a disadvantage to the Romans. Yet the speech of Pericles does not map neatly onto the speech of Calgacus in an easy one-to-one correspondence. When Calgacus encourages his men because in the hybrid Roman army, many either have no country or one far away, aut nulla pleriusque patria aut alia est, he contradicts the sentiment of Pericles. Whereas the Athenians are easily victorious against men defending their homes, the Britons will be victorious against men who are not defending their homes. Thus, by Calgacus' logic, the Romans are doubly disadvantaged, being neither homogeneous nor on home turf. The implication is that the Athenians are capable of an expansionist empire, Romans, not so much. Now, reference to the funeral oration of Thucydides, of Pericles, signals the influence of Thucydides on both Tacitus and the audience that would recognize the gesture. By reprising the ideas of Pericles in the speech of Calgacus, Tacitus harnesses the persuasive power of the funeral oration to deliver a crushing condemnation of Roman cowardice. He uses one of the most memorable encomia of Greek historiography, not for praise, but for blame. Furthermore, as Dylan Saylor reminds us, like Sallust, Thucydides also wrote history from the outside. Their alienation from political involvement strengthens their claims to authority and increases respect for their histories. This is what Saylor would argue, that Tacitus reappropriates the Sallustian career so as to gain a purchase on the canon. But I would add that attention to fear allows us to see how Tacitus reappropriates colonial discourse of Sallust and Thucydides, but for his own purposes. As governor of Britain, Agricola instilled fear to impose discipline on his men and subdue the tribes. Warned by his fear, he made sound decisions. His exercise of fear is thus congruent with his moderatio, and it complements his ability to command. By contrast, Domitian's fears are sinister. He receives news of Agricola's success with a happy face, but an anxious heart. That's back to passage 4. The celebration of Agricola was particularly alarming to him. Id sibi maxime formidulosum. Agitated by such cares, talibus curis exercitus, he decided to suspend his hatred for the present. When Agricola died, it was easier for Domitian to conceal his joy than his fear. Qui facilius dissimularet gaudium quam metum. And that brings us to the last mention of fear in the biography. So to conclude, by paying attention to the vocabulary of fear in the Agricola, we've been able to connect ideas found in Sallust and Thucydides. The literary allusions reveal inconsistencies and instabilities that blur the boundaries of Roman and non-Roman. The valorization of Jugurtha is precisely the kind of internal contradiction that belies a Romanocentric narrative of a non-Roman. Sallust appropriates Jugurtha, or rather Sallust has accurately portrayed the assimilation of the non-Roman to Roman rule. The irony is that Jugurtha dies to the great benefit of Rome. In alluding to Jugurtha in the characterization of Agricola, Tacitus finishes the job of making Jugurtha into a good Roman. Calgacus, too, is the ideal barbarian, who, from the vantage point of outsider, is able to deliver the criticism that none else dared. In his voice, Tacitus points directly to the debilitating effects of fear and the degenerating sovereignty of a Senate bound to a tyrant. Now, these remarks could be interpreted as revealing a real and highly destructive contradiction within the biography and even within Roman society, or at least Tacitus's perception of it. Much of the fear in the Agricola could be read as ironic. We might learn more about cowardice than fear. By praising Agricola's bravery, Tacitus can attack the senatorial elite for their cowardice. Then there's the possibility that the Agricola merely trots out fear not for some ulterior design, but to expose the full range of social interaction. The fact that fear is rooted in uncertainty about a future outcome makes it a slippery subject to pin down, and so more prone to what we would call reader response. That is to say, the Roman elite senatorial reader learns more about his own fears than the fears of Agricola, Domitian, the Roman army, or the tribes of Britain. Such an assertion would find firmer footing in an analysis of fear across the entire Tacitean corpus, which would allow us to assess whether the Roman reader had more or less to fear over time, perhaps. In his seminal study of the colonial discourse at the heart of the Agricola, Stephen Rutledge identified two rhetorical strategies by which Tacitus acts as what he calls an abettor in the colonial process. The first is negation. Negation reduces Britain to an empty frontier, such that by the second strategy of appropriation, Tacitus can assert Roman cultural superiority. In spite of the internal contradictions and instability that simultaneously denigrate and idealize the Britons, Rutledge regards the Agricola as consistent with a larger rhetorical program that is, quote, that is used not only to reaffirm but to expand Roman power, end quote. So I wouldn't disagree with Rutledge's conclusions, but I do maintain that our observations on fear yield a more nuanced understanding of the tensions in the Agricola. Any confrontation between Romans and non-Romans raises two possibilities. One, if the non-Roman barbarians have a stronger fighting force and a higher moral character than the Romans, then there's the unnerving possibility that A, the Romans could be defeated, or B, if victorious, have crushed a people unjustly. 2, if the barbarians are weaker, then there's the unnerving possibility that they will infect the Romans. Through prolonged contact, the Romans will become weaker. That is, a reverse cultural assimilation could take place. Self-definition depends on a clear distinction between Roman and other. As Nancy Shoemate puts it, the colonizer needs above all for the other to remain other in the end. If neither proposition is desirable, then the value of imperial expansion is itself negated. Just best to stay at home. However, such entrenchment in turn invites invasion. So the Romans have no choice but to go on the offensive. When Tacitus compares Agricola to Jugurtha, or has Calgacus echo Pericles, he reveals his inability to pass definitive judgment on the necessity of imperial expansion. Even so, Tacitus does not shrink from the impasse. By invoking the authority of Thucydides and Sallust, he turns it to his advantage. By carefully balancing praise and blame of imperial expansion, he allows for the rejection of both. Being neither wholly good nor wholly bad, the dilemma is dismissed. The bigger problems are back at Rome, where the doctrine of metus hostilis, or fear of a foreign enemy, is reinscribed in the political arena. As fear of an external enemy promotes internal social unity, so fear of the tyrant Domitian promotes a disunity and social weakness. And in the end, no amount of imperial expansion could compensate for the damage caused by a degenerate principate. Thank you.
about his ability to properly manage fear individually, and then sort of the effective use of fear in confronting barbarians, say. So, with that in mind, I was wondering what you thought about the section on the tyrant, I suppose, in Agricola. So, for instance, there seems to be rumblings of popular discontent about helping to go on an age right now because it's looking for sort of a new general, but Agricola is strongly urged to stay away from it, I guess. There's not really the traditional fear language, but it sort of calls that line. I'm just going to get your thoughts on that in terms of
Yes. And well, when I thought about it, and when I'll expand on this, what I'll do is compare that with Rubellius Blandus in the Annals in Book 13. And Rubellius Blandus was perceived by the Emperor Nero to be somebody who wanted his job. And so Rubellius Blandus didn't want his job. I mean, nobody wants to be emperor, but Nero says to Rubellius Blandus, you ought to go to Asia. It's so nice there. Lovely flowers and trees, and your wife can take up knitting, and you guys should go. And Rubellius Blandus is smart enough to go. Take the hint. And so that part in the Agricola, I guess because I'm really at heart a reader of the Annals first, when I got to it, I thought, oh, that smells just like the Rubellius Blandus story. So none of this really helps answer the question of how it fits in with fear, except to say that fear is, I want to say this right, fear is an intrinsic characteristic of tyranny, and so the tyrant has to live in fear. And so I think what you're seeing is, you're right, there isn't the language, like the diction of fear, but the mindset of the tyrant is that he always has to be watching his back. And so sometimes you get a nice Rubellius Blandus or an Agricola who can take the hint. Because almost what the tyrant is more afraid of is that they don't take the hint, and then you have to do something about it. And then your status diminishes even more. So the tyrant's really in a pickle because he's fearful, and so you think less of him. But then if this guy isn't smart enough to be fearful in return, then you actually have to do something, and then you look even worse. So I really like David Constant's status approach to fear, and the way it makes us think of someone in better or less terms. And this isn't really answering your question, except to say that you're spot on with that example. So how to answer your question? Yes. And to say that it's another example of the way fear is an intrinsic part of tyranny, and you're constantly making sure that you exercise it, and if you're lucky, you get a guy like Agricola who can take the hint, and you don't have to look so bad. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, the fears that he has in composing are couched in, how should I say this? I'm afraid to write this. Because I know during the reign of Nero, we had guys who wrote biographies of great men, and they got their heads chopped off. So I don't want to end up like that. So again, I'm stuck being a reader of the Agricola through the lens of the Annals, which I'll have you know makes no sense because he wrote the Agricola first. So it's totally my head that's doing this. But, and also, just so you know, the fragmentary end of the Annals is about Thrasea, who is, by the way, the person that he starts with in the Agricola. So the whole corpus of Tacitus sort of chases its tail, which is to say he's really bothered by the risk that you take when praising a good man under a bad emperor. And it's a fear that I think pervades his entire corpus. And I really should pay more attention to it in not just the expulsion of the philosophers, but the biographers. And the way he, that's a great comment. I'll put Rebellius Blandus in there too, but he starts off by situating his fear about writing the Agricola in a tradition of biographers who had things to fear as well. That's great. That's great. You had a question?
Yes, kind of feedback on those two, because that's the passage, the one where he's afraid of people because he's one of the authors. Yeah, that's kind of on that question.
Okay.
So I think the idea of fear is kind of the author's bias. Agricola looked at it there can be great men even in the bad. So this idea of I'm just following what the emperor tells me to do, for that, not Tacitus, but Agricola was just following what the emperor told him to do. You know what I mean? It's he wasn't really scared, but when we look at the Britons, when they're just following what their leaders tell them to do, that's actually fear. So in the sense that fear is always just fear for Tacitus is really just often bias, and people are biased by their own people on the other side of the world their rules.
That's wonderful, because I'd always consider it in terms of subjectivity and objectivity, but now you're making me think about the author bias as well, the Roman-centric or the Britain-centric point of view.
Really, it's his father-in-law. He wants to write this to make him look and see perspective. So he can't be Agricola was seriously going to perspective. He was a good man under a bad emperor, and so he had to follow his rule. Whereas the Britons, like you were saying, the Britons for the hunting party, maybe Agricola is right at that state of fear where he's paralyzed and can't do it. He's not running away, but he just has to do what the mission tells him to do.
That's awesome. Because, so the hunting thing is so cool, just so you know, because one of the few things we know about Tacitus' personal life was that he was an avid hunter, and he actually liked to hunt. So it kind of bothers me that the only metaphor in the whole Agricola is to hunting? That can't be. So now what you're saying, though, is you're making me take that hunting metaphor another step further, which is to go back to the biographers who are afraid to. So what happens in the hunting metaphor? Okay, so there you are, you're going to hunt, and first it's the most fierce animals that come out of the bush at you.
Which would have been if Agricola was more fierce, than he would have went after the mission, because he was he was mad.
You're totally right. But it's also like Arulenus Rusticus and Herennius Senecio. Those first biographers were the first one out of the bush, and the ones left behind are me, Tacitus, or Agricola, who's that is amazing. So thank you. How am I going to write that down in a quick note to self? Hunting metaphor, and I will not. Plus, it's on tape. That's excellent. That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, Rebecca.
to write about historical figures because we already know the outcome. So the reader is in such a different place because we know how the battle ended up, or we know how things ended up. So even if we try to get in that place, we can't be in that place because it's historical fear rather than fictional fear, right? So our author can't get us to feel that fear. It's not uncertain anymore. It's history. So I was just wondering if you could say more about the dynamic of what it means for Tacitus to thematize an emotion hinged on uncertainty when he's writing history where everything is uncertain for readers. So what is that? What does he want? How does he want a reader to interact with that emotion, given they can't feel it? I guess that's right.
That's great. Okay. It's the same question I came up against with conspiracy, where the answer there was suspense. It creates a suspense that, I mean, let's face it, even the Iliad, you know how it's going to end, you know? And so, or you go to a Greek tragedy. You know Medea's going to kill those kids. You just don't know if you're going to be able to see it or not. And so I would, you know, a younger me, you know, 10 years ago would have said suspense. But I'm more inclined to try and think along with David Levine along lines of where we would expect a cause and effect, to read it the other direction in terms of an effect and a cause. So that, you know, then David Levine helps, but he doesn't really answer your question, which is why? You know, why put your reader through that? Or I always like to put the word risk in the question. So why risk freaking your reader out? You know? Yeah.
You know, instead of bonding with your subject, you could actually because you're not uncertain the way those people
Yes. Well, there's also a part of me that would say it allows the reader a kind of moral superiority. And that always goes over big, you know. But I don't think I don't know the answer. But I think it's a lot of different things at once. I would say, because I'm for some reason bent on the colonial discourse thing, that it's probably a similarity across colonial discourses. Because, you know, what you're really afraid of, is what I was talking about is like, what if we can't maintain our Romanitas? And if we hang out with these people long enough, we're going to start wearing pants, sitting up at tables, and using forks. And those are, you know, those are very non-Roman things, right? And there's that's, it's always the unspoken fears that I think are the most powerful and most interesting. And in a way, that's what's so creepy about Greek tragedy, is they'll throw it out there, but they won't get really close to saying what you should really be afraid of, but there's always a back down moment. So, in other words, why do it? And it's almost like a maneuver or a masking maneuver to sort of walk away from what the real fear is, which is that Agricola hung out with a lot of barbarians, and we really, really hope that when he comes home, he's still going to be a blue-blooded Roman like the rest of us. And it's kind of dicey out there. And the whole expansionist proposition, we go to Dacia, we go to Pannonia, we go to Spain, we go to all these places, and what if we come back and we're not Roman anymore? And, you know, it's Juvenal who expresses these fears, too, in terms of xenophobia, and Juvenal's really worried about this as well. So, let's see, to answer your question, I would say that it's, well, tonight I would say, that it's this unspoken fear of losing that Roman identity. And so he writes it in this way to sort of bolster it or it like, these are proper fears. These are good Roman fears. We're going to manage them right. We're going to use it to our advantage. We're going to turn it around and make sure that, by God, when we come home, Latin still has 5 cases plus the locative. And, we are not going to submit to that barbarian tongue, So...
Really descriptive about the scenery in a way. He would himself choose the position of the campus. He talked about how he was criticizing, maybe implicitly, the Roman Senate as a more general criticism. Could he be criticizing increasing urbanization in Rome, the centralization of influence in the city itself, as opposed to the traditional agrarian roots of the Republic?
I'm trying to think where else he would have done this. Sure. You're absolutely right. Yeah, his contemporary, I wouldn't say they were friends, but the poet of satire, Juvenal, whom I mentioned, he also, he's Juvenal says, "Are you kidding? I got to get out of Rome. This place it's like too crowded, and people there's garbage in the streets, and the apartment buildings are so close together they catch on fire, and there's no fire department, and it's full of these crazy foreigners, and I just have to get back out to the countryside." So what I'm saying is that that's a mindset that's going on at this time in the Trajannic and Hadrianic literature. And but it's curious, I'm trying to think where else in Tacitus he would talk in these terms about a longing for a bygone countryside. Normally when we think about Tacitus as nostalgia, it's political, like we long for the Republican days. But I had never really thought of Tacitus as nostalgia in terms also of a city versus country dichotomy. The story of the city mouse and the country mouse and how they visit each other and each can't stand the other place. It was actually from the satire poet Horace, from one of his satires, but Juvenal takes it up. And so I'm trying to think, is there a city mouse and a country mouse kind of story in Tacitus? I think his criticism of urbanization is just implicit and taken for granted. And you've actually spotted a kind of more pastoral, or as you say, a romanticizing of a more country lifestyle, which we get completely in his description of the Germans in his work called the Germania, where they know how to live off the land and they don't live in these cities. So that would probably be the best example of it. But I hadn't thought about it in terms of the Agricola. As for the fortuitous name, every now and then we get these really cool names that just you want to say. But on the other hand, look at my last name is Pagan, and I study Romans, so I don't know. And I know an archaeologist whose last name is Stone. His mother's last name is Skinner, and she is a dermatologist. So it happens sometimes. And so anytime I want to make a big deal out of a Roman name, I just think, look, Pagan, give it up. So.
One more question, and if people have other questions after that, we can chat and questions.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
While being under people who are obviously so fearful of themselves
That's a very eloquent summary, I think, of what I'm trying to get at. And in fact, I didn't really know it when I was working on this book on conspiracy theory, but I think the period of the emperors Trajan and Hadrian, which is normally looked on as, they're one of the 5 great emperors, and they say that the happiest time in all of civilization was lived under these emperors. We had the most prosperity and the most security and the most chances for advancement. The world was most civilized under these 5 emperors, and I think the more closely we scrutinize, the more we see that there are some cracks in the armor there, and it might not have been all it was cracked up to be. So, yes. It was not, I would say yes, it's not as secure as it looked to be. And you got it just right, that you're kind of crushed between the border expansions, but then if you go home, there are worries there. In between. Somewhere in between. And I guess it's that maiden agon, nothing in excess, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little this way, a little that way, that'll get the job done best. And I think the overall theme of the Agricola, always it comes back to moderation, balance, not too much, not too tall, not too short, not too fat, not too skinny, just perfect. And that's what Agricola was, is he was just good enough, but not too good and not too bad, and everything right down the middle. But it's really hard to do. And so he was one guy who could do it. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, thank you. You've given me a lot to think about. Thank you.